Hello everyone, Autumchild here with a bit of an art video for you, different from my speed paints. Now, a while ago I did a Tumblr poll asking if you guys would be interested in seeing a bit of an art tutorial of how I do my work. And a lot of you definitely said yes. So, that's what I'm going to be doing today. I've got my reference photo here in the subject, just so you guys can see what I do, because I always use a reference for a pose whenever I can't quite get what I need in my head. I normally have it in a separate window, but for the video's sake, I have it here so you have an idea of how I block out my poses. Which is what we'll be starting with here. So references on one layer, my rough sketch, which I should name. Always name your layers, that way you never lose them. Is where we'll be putting the base pose. So just because I draw a little differently from the poses I use, I don't do the whole tracing thing, which actually is not a bad thing. If you're a starting artist and you need a good reference and want to do out the block pose, you can actually go over, place your lines, and then move it over, see if it looks the way you want it. If not, you can adjust it later. It's using a reference, it's not plagiarism, because you're going to be turning it into something different. As much as some people say not to, but in most cases I can never get it adjusted the way I want, so I usually start raw, which is what I'm going to be doing here. Now, as you've probably noticed, my drawing is a little different from usual. I'm actually drawing full size on the screen instead of zooming in, zooming out. That's because I recently just got a drawing display tablet. I've been using my Wacom Bamboo pen and touch tablet for several years now, and I thought finally probably about time I get something a little more fancy. I always kind of start with a bit of a build with the rough, that way you can get a better idea of what your movement is, and you can place the extra detail once you've got the base rough done. Lots of life drawing classes definitely helped with this. One thing I should probably mention is, unlike Clip Studio Paint, I'm working inside right now, I should be mentioning that, you can't really use the Shift key to make lines. Sai has its own feature where the line work layer, it has its own line and curve tools, making things a little bit easier. From there you can merge it into a regular layer and work with it the same way, otherwise you're going to get some snapping. Just a little tip I like to give in case you need some straight lines and can't figure out why the Shift key doesn't work. Alright, there is my rough sketch complete. Oh, one last thing I forgot. There we go. So now I have no longer need for pose. You can get rid of that and save what I've got. You definitely want to save often, because if something happens where the thing crashes or your power goes out or who knows what, you'll always have a backup. Not everything does an autosave. Sai's not one of those that do. I know Clip Studio and Photoshop are, so if you're using those, make sure you have your autosave kicking. Alright, so now I'm going to drop the opacity down because I'm going to be drawing over top of this. I usually go to about 30% just because it's still nice and visible for me. Then I go on to doing a draft layer, which I normally just call sketch. Now, I normally will try and work in a nice orange layer so it's easy to see. And for that, I use my color palette up here and change it to Sketch and Lumi to give me the orange color that I tend to like. You can also do that with Clip Studio and Photoshop under the hard light or pin light, if I'm remembering right. But I think it's hard or soft light. Could be one of those. Anyways, let's get on to doing the detail here. I always like to start with the face, and this is where I'm going to start zooming in. Because then you can get the more detailed work. The nice thing about your sketches is you can be messy as you need to. Also, having your rough on another layer means you can add extra detail when you feel you're missing something. And it won't affect your main work. Actually, should stop the fast forwarding and talk here. I've flipped the canvas just so I can have a better angle. Because I am left-handed, sometimes doing more detail is better if I change the angle to be the opposite side compared to what I did in the rough sketch. Alright, rough sketch is done, and since I do not need all this extra space, I'm actually going to cut down the area I'm working in by selecting it, and a nice little feature of Paint Tool size under the canvas. You can crop by selection. Paint Tool size has its own feature in a different area, and I believe Photoshop does too. Honestly, I think I like Photoshop and Size Tool better, but Size definitely has its charm. So now that I'm done with that, I no longer need my rough sketch, so I can get rid of that, and I can do my line work layer next. So, go back to my sketch, drop the opacity down to about 60, and back to the pen tool. I tend to work at a setting of 3 for my nib, and I will start with the colors. So when it comes to the colored line work, I always use the shade darker than the color I'm going to color in. That way it pops more but still has atmosphere to it. I do that with the eyes, the jewels, anything that I think would detail in color. I'm on the wrong layer. Once again, save. And now we get to the meat of it all. Alright, now for the solid color. I don't actually use a solid black, which I do have up here. I actually use this color here, which is kind of got a purple hue to it to make everything pop out more. I think it balances out with the characters over the solid black. Something about solid black kind of flattens everything out for me. Believe it or not, this is actually the same type of line color I believe Ghost Trick used. I just happen to end up matching a color very similar to it. Honestly, if you guys do want to experiment with anything here in my color palette, feel free. The nice thing about artwork is it's completely experimental, until you find just what you feel comfortable with, and even then some. Now, the nice thing about having a sketch is it kind of is just a guideline from what you want to do. If you need to make adjustments, you can do it mostly in the line work layer and not have to worry about making some adjustments later. Now, the reason I tend to drop the opacity is also so I can see the line work cleaner than I can the sketch, but if I still want to get a good look at it, you can always turn off that layer and see how things are coming along. For me, it looks like it's coming along quite smoothly so far. Alright, well, that just leaves the tails left, and normally what I will do here is I'll start up a new layer just so I don't mess up any I missed a spot. But I'll continue with my trail of thought here. If I always open up a new layer if I don't want to mess up any of the line work that I feel is good from that point on. From there, I just kind of do the detail of the line work, and if it looks just right, I erase the areas that I know won't get erased because it's on a separate layer, and then I merge it later, that way it's just all one piece. So let's fix up what I've done, and then I'll get on to the tails. And there we are, the major line work is finished. Now, the nice thing about the steps I've done is you can actually do a similar thing in an actual sketchbook. You can use a colored pencil or something to do out your rough sketch, a regular pencil to do out your draft sketch, and then use a bunch of different pens to get the different line thicknesses for your line work. Same thing goes for colored pens too. Now, unlike digital software where you can just outright delete the layer, in this situation you just erase everything underneath to get as clean as possible. From there, coloring will take a different turn. It'll depend on the medium you want to use, whether it be pencil crayons or colored pencils, markers, crayon, stuff, Copics, stuff like that. And that really comes down to your style when it comes to traditional work, or even same thing with digital. There's many different tools and assets you can use to get your own type of coloring style. Everyone's is different. Mine, it falls more into the animation side of it. where I start off with flat colors. So now that I have no need for this layer anymore, I just erased everything underneath, turning it back to normal and dropping or bringing the opacity back up to 100%, and I'm going to rename it to skin. When it comes to the skin, I like to do a nice flat base for the entire picture. That way I can just select that base and then I can color within it while I do the other layers. So I always start with the selection tool and select outside, get any open gaps I see, and then from there, come on, there we go. I'll take the select pen, and at 1.5 I'll go in and get the finer detail where I feel that it's not selecting everything. Nice thing about this feature inside, and I know Clip Studio has this as well, and it can be extremely helpful for this stage, because it's usually a little easier than trying to do with the lasso tool. So make sure you find any spots that you feel are sticking out, because that'll be important for the next step here. Okay, looking good on my end here. So now that I have everything on the outside selected, I'm going to invert that selection. I have a special button for that, but another way of doing it is, where is it? Selection, yeah, selection, invert. That's another way of doing it. And once I've done that, I'm going back to my skin layer, picking the color of the skin I want, and I'm going to fill in that layer. In Sai, it's always under the layer section, but in both Clip Studio and Photoshop, others I know that are good softwares, are under Edit and Fill. So now that I have that, I can deselect my layer, and now I've got my whole skin base. From there, I can just continue on. So let's start with the white. Again, naming layers, especially in the color stage, is important so you never lose track of it. By holding Control and clicking on that layer, it'll bring the selection back. And from there, I can change my pen to 10 because that's the one I feel most comfortable in. But you can change it to any one you feel more comfortable in. From there, I'm going to manually color in everything. So starting with the white. Nice thing about the lower layers is you don't have to be accurate, you can actually be messy, but once you get to the upper layers, you're going to have to be a little more detailed about it. Something like the eyes, I can be a little more detailed here, take my time. Same thing with the mouth. And so on and so forth from there. You can also, nice thing about selection is do this if you want to do a nice big section. I'm going to fix that line. And just take your bucket and fill in that spot, and that's all that's going to get filled. It won't affect anything else, but anything in that selection and where you cut off the lines. Do I have any more white here? No, that's all the white on that layer. From there on, you just continue on and rinse and repeat with the remaining layers. Every now and then I'll combine colors into a layer as well because they're usually far distances apart. It won't interfere with one another. And there we have it, the flat coloring. All that's left now is to do the shading of the character. Oh, I did forget one thing though. Visual effects. So let's do that before we do the shading. So right above all the other layers, I'm gonna put Aura, because that's what's coming off her scepter there, is her magical aura. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch over to the marker tool and I'm gonna set it to 50, that's good. And I'm gonna pick a color for the aura. So for Shimizu, she likes to use pretty much any magic she has at her disposal, which in my world has multiple different elements, as well as healing magic. I think for this situation, I'm gonna go with healing magic. So let's go with yeah, let's go with this shade of pink. And coming off, I'm going to do a nice aura. Marker tool gives you transparency in many shapes and forms, and you can layer it too, which is really nice. Follow the path I kind of had going earlier. I can have it kind of loop around, come around this way. And nice thing is I can just kind of take the eraser at the same size and readjust it the way I want. And I'm going to be as messy as I want with it here because all I have to do to erase it is select my skin layer and my line work layer. Doing that, I click on the skin and the line using Control and Shift to select multiple layers. And then from there, on the layer I'm using, I just erase what I don't need. So anything going behind her, I just erase. There we go. Do the same thing for the staff here. Kind of want it going behind the staff as well. Then you can invert your layer, like I said, selection, invert, or wherever it is on your settings. And from there, I'm going to make it give off a bit of a glow effect. So, before I do that, let's give off a color a little more neon. Let's go this direction, give it more of a brighter glow. There we go. And then do the same thing. Actually, I'm actually going to quickly deselect this here just so I can get what I need. There we are. And I can just do the same thing again. Drop that down. There we go. Leave it there, so do the same thing again and get rid of what I don't need. There we go. And from here I'll invert the layer, and I'm actually going to add into the selection here. Bring that up to 50. I'm going to add in around where the glow follows. Apparently I missed a spot. Nice thing about inverting. Right, I'm on a selection layer, so it's going to do that. There we go. Back to selection layer, invert. Ow. Do that there. There we go. So now that I've got my selection in place, I'm going to take my blur tool. I'm going to set it to 70, that should be good. I'm going to start inside and out. This will give the glow a nice gradation blur, which is gradation shading, I should say. This is pretty much the way I do most of my shading. This can work great for visual effects as well. And just because that's starting to interfere, I'm going to deselect. Do this instead, because if I get some of that glow to show onto the skin, it'll look more realistic like a light. Oops, Gotta be careful though, because you could end up erasing more than you bargained for by blurring it out. And if you guys are curious to try any of the settings of my tools as well, feel free. I find that those artists that say, oh, you don't use the same brush set as me, you're copying me, really kind of shut themselves out. They kind of leave themselves exposed to not improving. With art being such an experimental thing, especially with this all being preset, you can adjust this as many ways and shapes as you want. It's always changing. And get different results from using the same tools, altering the tools, or even using your own tools and getting some of the experimental results you want. I'm actually always changing things up every now and then, but most of my preset settings I've become quite happy with. But there's my visual effects, so I don't have to worry about that too much now. If you find that it's a little too loud, you just take the eraser on the layer and erase around the areas you feel it's too much. Like that. So there's that nice visual effect, which this you can actually experiment with too. Like with the different modes here, you can make it darker, you can make it brighter, which can't be seen on the white. That can't be seen on the white at all. Work in that. Shade. Shade and Lumi is usually a good go-to. And even when you put a background in there, if you so chose, it'll change the way the visual effects are. A nice neat thing I like to do every now and then is make a separate layer and play around with the modes and see what happens. Sometimes you can get really neat results. Like even playing with the opacity. Oh my god, that's blinding. But I think I'm quite happy with what I've got. That's too thick, so I'm going to delete that layer. And save once more. So all that's left now is the shading, which I've pretty much explained how I do with the aura, but let's go over it in a little more detail here. First off, let's put that layer down here by the skin, and I'm going to name that Skin Shadow. Now, I have a tendency to doing my shadows and highlights on the same layers, but you can choose to do them separately if you so choose. So oh, I dried my throat out. Give me a sec. Much better. Anyways, selecting the layer you want to work with is just Control, selecting the layer, and make sure you're on the proper layer because you can accidentally select your layer by mistake. Just make sure you have your right layer selected, have that selected, and I'm going to use the marker tool, which has always been my go-to for shading. Pick the shade darker. If you do not have that shade there, you can actually play with the color palette. I tend to use this, but most people will probably have a color wheel and mess around with that. There's actually many different things you can use to alter colors, but I've got my preset panel here, so I have everything I need. And that is the wrong shadow. That's the one I want. And from there, you kind of just do where you want the light to show. Because I have the light coming off of the aura here, this is going to be the direction my lighting goes. So I use that. Shading pretty much just comes from the natural way of life, and it depends on the direction of the light. And everything gives off a shadow or highlight in some shape or form. Now, because I do have it in here, it's going to be a little more prominent. And because I do have some of that pink coming off of it, I'm going to add a bit of pink highlight with it. But only where it's really expressive. And then from there, I just take my blur tool, which I'm going to drop down to 10 just so I don't get so much blur like I did with the aura. And I'm just going to blur in the detail with the gradation shading method. Once I feel I've gotten it the way I want, I just move on to the next step. And from here, I'll be repeating this step with the rest of the shadows and highlights. And there we have it. All that's left to do now is just to place, where should I? My signature. There we go. So that is pretty much how I do all of my artwork. When it comes to animation, I kind of just take a step back and don't really put in the shading because I honestly don't have any lighting to really worry about when it comes to my animation work. The movement kind of speaks for itself, but when it comes to detailed illustrations, this is about as basic as my shading gets. I have a base shadow, have a base highlight, and then with the blur tool, I cause some gradation shading to give that pop. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this little tutorial. I've sped my way through anywhere I wasn't talking and got to the end result. So with that, I'm gonna stop here. I hope you guys enjoyed I can't say that. Oh. Well, either way, this is Autumchild saying I'll see you all next time.